Welcome. Let's talk about religion, right? That's what the slide says. My name is Patrick De Silva, and I will be your host, as I see my role, for this initial discussion of talking about religion and the study of religion. Um, and I'm just happy to be here with you. Thank you for tuning in or downloading this or viewing it however you are viewing it. Why don't we go ahead and get started? So what is this thing called religion anyway? You know, I like this cartoon, even though it's unfortunately very uh, appears to be dominated by all men. But we have people from different religious traditions, and basically the idea of this cartoon is, oh, everyone thinks that their tradition is the one that holds on to truth or that expresses truth most fully. But where do we get these different ideas? So I think the main sources are sort of where we grow up, our family background, our um, religious affiliation, if we have one, right? And then I think more broadly, our community and cultural environment. These are what I would say are main sources of where we get our ideas about where religion comes from, what religion is, what kinds of religions are out there, what are we familiar with. And we could go here into a little bit broader point about the differentiation, if we can make one, between religion and culture. That's an often debated and certainly discussed topic um, that I think when we get a little bit further and talk about the interdisciplinary nature of religious studies, then we can highlight that distinction or the attempt to make a distinction. And just here at the end of this slide, I'd like to bring up this question: what types of definitions do other people use? So here, you can even just like pause on the recording before moving to the next slide. I'd like you just to think, what type of definition of religion do you have in mind? Maybe even do something like, imagine you hear the word religion, and then what are the first 5 words that come to mind, or you can jot them down. I think it's good to be kind of self-reflective and interrogate, yourself, like what does this thing mean to me, and then think about, well, what could it mean to other people, and how do we deal with the existence of multiple definitions? So I think one thing that's worth talking about is the differentiation between religious studies and theology. So, we'll start actually over here. So theology being more literally, God talk, and religious studies being talking about God or gods or goddesses or the goddess, depending on what context we're in. Uh, Theology I would describe as, and I have it here, just confessional and normative um, claims made from inside a tradition about how things should be. So imagine a religious leader giving a sermon to her community, to her congregation, about the proper way to understand and interpret sacred text. Or imagine someone talking to a group of children, right, in a religious education sense, about, oh, well, this is how we should understand God's message from whether it's a religious text or it's a holiday, it's some type of celebration. But it's understood that this is the understanding for our group, right? So from within a tradition about what things should be. Um, Contrast that with the observational and descriptive approach that I feel we follow in religious studies, where we stand outside of a tradition and talk about how things appear to be based on the data that we can collect with the tools available to us. Um, so, for example, in a slide later on, I'll talk through the many different sets of tools that we use in religious studies. So when we talk about data, like a sacred text can be a data point, or a part of it could be a data point, or a ritual within a tradition could be a data point. Um, you know, we use words like data when we're observing things, we're trying to describe things, and we're really not trying to put a value judgment on it in terms of, oh, well, it should be like this. Instead, we're stepping back and saying, well, this is how we see it functioning, whatever the it is. Now, to be clear, there are many different scholars of religion who hold religious beliefs and religious commitments across the denominational spectrum, across different religious traditions. So I'm not saying that to do religious studies you have to be somehow without religious, belief or commitment. But instead to say that there is a difference in the point of view, the mindset that we have when we approach something as a practitioner or a devotee of it versus I'm going to attempt to adopt a more observational and descriptive and analytical point of view. So I mentioned earlier that religious studies is this interdisciplinary approach, and so what does that mean? If we look here, we've got philology and linguistics, so textual analysis, learning lots of different languages. We talked a little bit earlier about philosophy, or at least theology, and comparing that with religious studies. Race, gender, and sexuality, critical studies of all these subjects have become increasingly important, really across the academy, thankfully, but in religious studies in particular. For example, the most recent issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and the AAR is my main disciplinary home. The opening line is, opening roundtable is all about the study of race and religion. With psychology and mythology, I teach a world mythology course, and we talk a lot about how scholars from psychology, people like Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, moving forward, Joseph Campbell, and many others have used the types of analysis that look at individuals' sort of mental and psychological states, and then use that to extrapolate about the origins of religion. Anthropology and sociology, you think about ethnography, where people go to a particular location, especially one that's very different from their own, and are really immersed in it for a number of years. Um, that's the kind of thing that scholars are doing to try and learn more about how this concept of religion shows up in different societies. My friend TJ and colleague in this series of presentations, he is going to be talking about how to study religion using art. So I won't say too much about this other than that I think using art, archaeology, material culture in general is really a wonderful way, and really a very tangible, sometimes literally concrete way to learn more about different traditions. And along with something concrete like a building, then something tangible like the body and things that the body does. So ritual and embodiment theory is also something that we would look at in religious studies. And then political science, economics, sometimes in religious studies, well, especially for me with my specialist field in Islamic studies, I look a lot at Orientalism and ideas of religion that are transported and exported from Western Europe to Africa and South Asia in particular, through the the European colonial expansion. And so political science and economics are all kind of bound up in that. So all of these things are available to us as scholars of religion, and really, I would stress anyone who's going to think critically about a subject, I would say, go ahead, consider yourself a scholar. That's how I see it. So this slide is about how we have defined religion, especially operating here in the what I call the Euro-American Academy. And if you read Tomoko Motozawa's book on the history of world religions as a category, then she makes this very wonderful argument. Well, I say wonderful because I think it's very well done. That really specifically Protestant Christianity was used as this template against which other traditions were measured, and this is happening, in the 1800s and in the 1900s, especially even in the 1700s when we have this colonial expansion. European countries expanding around the globe, and of course they encounter people. And one of the things that they use to determine, okay, what do we do with these people? How do we treat them? Is do they have religion? And they ask the question in such a way that if they have religion or not was a function of, can we recognize things in their society, in their communities that conforms or lines up with what, quote unquote, we have in ours. So if we look at Christianity generally, we have a strong belief in an all-powerful deity. We have a codified set of written texts of scripture. We have centralized institutions. We also have an emphasis on faith, on belief, right? On this internalized feeling that I think is definitely very important within Protestant communities. You see this in debates over, faith versus works, coming especially out of the Reformation. And so when these Europeans encountered communities that didn't have some of these things, then it set the stage for, kind of in the context of a colonial encounter, it really set the stage for, well, these people need our help, and as we control and reform their societies, we're going to control and reform them, and try and convert them, as well as make so many other changes to their societies. So, this is a big part of religious studies. If you go to the American Academy of Religion conference, AAR grew out of a group of scholars who just worked on the Bible, and that's still a very dominant demographic within our organization. And you can see how it's like you can see how the organization has developed with that as its base, which, if you were starting an organization today looking at the scholarly study of religion, it would look pretty different. And as I alluded to elsewhere in the presentation, we have all these different disciplinary tools that we use now, things that definitely were not used, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So it's a very much an exciting time, I'd say, to be studying religion, and part of that is really questioning this or learning about this history of defining religion and how that has shifted from time and place. All right, our first sort of case study in studying religion a little bit more deeply and critically is taking a close, hard look at Scripture. So one of my favorite examples that I go over in my classes often is looking at the book of Genesis, chapters 1 and 2, where we have these creation stories. Notice I'm using the plural because there really are two creation stories in this initial section of Genesis. I won't spoil it for you, but you can read it a bit more closely yourselves if you want. But there are different names used for God. There's Yahweh, there's Elohim. If you read it, you have different sort of an order of creation. You have in one version, man and woman created at the same time. In another version, you have first man created, then woman, famously out of Adam's rib. And even as another example of what we gain through a close study here, kind of applying that philology that I mentioned earlier is sort of a hallmark of studying religion, that in Hebrew, we read that, God created Adam, right? Adam out of Adamah, which, this clay or mud. And so when you read it in the original, it rhymes there's a euphony there that makes it very clear that this person, this sort of first person, is created out of the earth, and the language itself reaffirms that. So as we move forward, I'm giving lots of homework, I think, in this presentation, which of course you don't have to do, but I'd encourage everyone to think about what you gain and possibly what you lose by reading super closely. And I think especially when you engage with a religious text, well, any text, but here in the context of our presentations, what do we gain or lose by accessing a religious text in translation? So for many people who are from a Christian background and you're reading either you'd call it the Old Testament, and obviously in Judaism it's the Hebrew Bible, but it's most of it's written in Hebrew, some sections in Aramaic, but most Christians are not reading it in those languages. And same thing goes for the New Testament, which I'll get to in our next slide, written in Greek. So what do we lose by not reading it in the original language? And also, what do we gain is something for us to think about. All right, now we'll move on. Okay, so now we have my second example here from looking at Scripture is looking at the New Testament, and specifically I want to talk about just the 4 canonical Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these early recollections, these stories written about Jesus of Nazareth. This put on the pointer. This is a fragment of our earliest manuscript from the New Testament. So I believe it's 3rd or 4th century and Common Era, which in and of itself tells you, that we are relying on these manuscript collections that were put together by early Christian communities and eventually are codified in the various councils and kind of early and then even into almost the medieval period, where church leaders gathered together and decided that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were going to be the only Gospels included in this New Testament. Early on, we had dozens of Gospels, and if you look up things like the Gnostic Gospels, like Elaine Pagels has a wonderful book about that, we have this treasure trove of manuscripts found in Egypt at Nag Hammadi, mostly written in Coptic, that have all these other Gospels, and the presentation of Jesus in those other accounts is very different. So some scholars treat some of these other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas in particular, as they just have so many examples of it that they look at it and say, oh, well, this is another viable version of early Christianity. And so when we look at something like the Gospels in the New Testament, then we get this incredibly diverse picture of how Christianity could have developed if church leaders had decided differently, if they'd included some of these other accounts. So the homework here in this slide is, how do we interpret the history specifically of these religious traditions when we look at Scripture, and we look at it not so much from the kind of super fine granular level that maybe I was alluding to in looking at the creation stories contained in the first few chapters of the book of Genesis, but instead look at the corpus or the canon as a whole and think about, okay, when was this formed? In my own specialty field of Islamic studies, we spend a lot of time looking at the Quran and looking at the copious detailed notes that early Muslim scholars dating back to very early on in the Muslim period, so by the 8th century Common Era, if not earlier, paying attention to, okay, how is this thing called the Quran being formed? Similarly, we could look at Hindu scripture, Buddhist scripture, any type of scripture, and look at the historical moments when it settled into the form that we have it today. None of these things sprang, at least from the religious studies point of view, these are all constructed, and if it's constructed, then there are humans involved, and whether we see that as divinely inspired or not depends kind of on our confessional point of view. But from a religious studies standpoint, we really can learn so much about these communities by looking at how they developed their scriptural traditions. Okay, we'll pause there. Well, we just talked about a couple of ways of studying religious scripture to learn more about a religious tradition, but another great example is studying sacred sites. So I just pulled an image here of the Kaaba from Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So the Kaaba is sort of the axis mundi, if you will, central sort of pivot point for Muslims. And you can see here, this is from during the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of these 5 so-called pillars of Islam. And actually this year, again, I'm recording in June of 2020, they just announced that there are going to be severe limitations on how many pilgrims can come to Mecca this year for the Hajj out of concern for the COVID-19 pandemic. So that right there, we can talk about what happens when you have a ritual, which involves lots of people going to the same place. And in this case, there's all kinds of rituals. I'll talk about it in more detail when I do my presentation on Islam later on in this current series. But what happens when that is curtailed or even just cut off for millions of people? What kind of disruption does that cause for people who are within a religious community? Now think about it, not so much in terms of a global pilgrimage, but what happens when your local church or synagogue or temple, all of a sudden you can't go to it? What does that do to your daily and weekly routine and life, and how does that affect you? Again, coming from this very, I'd say, Protestant emphasis on faith and accessing religious texts as an individual, this is largely, until I'd say more recently, been ignored in religious studies because we've been so focused on textual analysis and what individuals think about texts. And now, thankfully, we're looking much more broadly, and looking at sacred sites is an important way of understanding how communities function, and of course individuals within those communities. So even there in Pitkin County, what types of sacred sites are you familiar with? This is sort of an interesting exercise, is to study and make a list of, well, these are all the different churches, and these are different synagogues and mosques and temples and so forth. This is the religious landscape of where you live, and I think you learn a lot about your community through studying things this way. And there will be a link later on in the presentation to the Pew research site that has a lot of great statistical data they've gathered on things like this. Okay, we'll go on now to our next example of sacred sites. And in our second example, looking at sacred sites, I wanted to just show a picture from one of the most important sacred sites, in the world that I can think of, which is Jerusalem. And Unlike our first example, which focused on a place that was important to a single tradition, in the case of Jerusalem, we have this city that has been and continues to be of vital importance to three separate traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I'm going to be doing the presentations focused on each of those three traditions, so I'll be coming back to Jerusalem in each of those cases. But simply as maybe a preview of coming attractions, as one of my professors used to say, if we look at Jerusalem, we have what I call intertwining sacred histories. We have the site of, um, well, it was Solomon's temple, and then King David's expansion of it, the second temple, which was then eventually destroyed during the Jewish revolt against Roman colonial and imperial occupation and rule in the first century of the Common Era. And what we have is this remnant of it, which is a very holy site for Judaism today. Now, right next door, you can see this mosque with this golden dome, which is one of the most important sites within Islam. This is supposed to be the site involving the Prophet Muhammad's ascension into heaven, the night journey, which is one of his actually two miracles that are accorded to him. And so obviously within the modern day history, especially since the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948, then we have these overlapping not only religious sites and claims to sites, but these things factor into the political realm, of course. How do we negotiate access to these sacred sites? So my invitation for you at the end of this year is can you think of some other sites that that multiple communities view as sacred, and how have those communities negotiated access and sort of preserving those sites, and what happens when one community has a great deal more power than the other? How does that play into those dynamics? So now here we are, we just talked about sacred sites, and then linked to that, of course, are the religious festivals that take place at those sites, usually at specific times during the year or every few years. So this picture is from the Kumbh Mela from 2019 in Prayagraj in India. The importance of the gathering, which gathers literally tens of millions of people, is deeply rooted in sort of Hindu sort of history slash mythology. That at these different rivers and sites along those rivers in India, that there is this interaction between the gods, and then there's this way of tapping into that energy for people today from going to those sites. So when we look at religious festivals, and you could, right now as I'm talking, you can think about what festivals you grew up with, what are you familiar with? Think about, okay, well, why was that important? What did I do, or what did the people I knew who participated in it, what did they do, and how did they see those actions affecting something? So, another part of a festival, we also think about holidays. So we could talk about like Lent within Christianity. We could talk about Hanukkah within Judaism. I've mentioned, the Hajj pilgrimage. We could also talk about Ramadan in Islam. Festivals and holidays, holidays, literally holy day, are a huge part of the communal life that energizes energizes these religious traditions. Sometimes we look at these traditions, especially if they're foreign to us, as kind of dried and dusty, and we read awkward translations that we find. And we don't really have a lot of texture, to say, oh, this is a lived tradition. So religious festivals are a wonderful way to address that imbalance. And I just think if you ever have the opportunity, if there's a cultural festival even near you, if there's a religious festival that you would feel comfortable, going to, even if you know nothing about the community, you could call that community center and say, oh, I'm interested in learning. Maybe there are going to be restrictions for a while around these types of things just due to COVID. But any way that you can, I think you can learn so much. And I really love attending festivals. Um, I'll talk about it a little bit more in the presentations that I'll be doing on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam later in the series. But I think you just get a very different sense of what traditions are by looking at how people are living them in these sort of special moments. So here in example 4, I want to talk about rituals. One of the things that rituals do for us is they mark transitions from one stage to another, and not only in religious communities. If you think about here in the United States, I always ask my college students what's an important coming of age ritual, and they said, "Oh, getting my driver's license." That's a big deal. We have in all these different traditions ways of marking birth, certainly coming of age, marriage, death, and lots of other things as well. This picture here that I have featured on the slide is from a Christian community that practices full immersion baptism. So for adults, and so it has strong precedent, attested in New Testament scripture that this became a part of Christian communities, and this idea of immersing yourself in water and sort of sanctifying, basically through your intention, sanctifying the experience, and that it's not just for the individual, but then the whole community participates. If we look at something like infant baptism in Roman Catholic communities, then you have this very ritualized sort of profession of intention by both the parents and then the godparents and everyone present. They are going to do everything they can to guide this child, who as an infant, doesn't get much of a choice in the matter. And certainly when we look at things like marriage and I think about when we look at death, there are very powerful rituals around death. I mean, so in some Jewish communities, like sitting Shiva after someone dies, and where you sit and you are, you're focused on the fact that this person in your life has passed away, and the community comes to you and helps you. There's a great deal of solace that can be found in these hard moments of life when you have a ritual to rely on. So I think for that reason, rituals are a very important thing, a way of studying religious traditions. So again, maybe you're tired of me saying it now, but consider, what kinds of rituals can you look back on in your own life? What were these big moments, whether you would classify it as religious or not? What were these big moments? And what were the real world consequences of those moments? So for example, you get your driver's license, you can drive a car. In the US, you turn 21, you can purchase alcohol. Not quite as exciting, you turn, 26, and if you're a man, then all of a sudden you can rent a car for a much lower rate. Those are kind of civic things, but of course we can think of lots of religious corollaries as well. And here in example 5, I want to tackle race, gender, and sexuality, of course, like all the other examples, very briefly, but only to say that when we look at religious traditions and we want to look at them using this lens of, or different lenses of race, gender, and sexuality, I think one of the basic things we can do is examine particular traditions' views on, full membership to their community and access to leadership positions. There are some communities that have allowed women to hold leadership positions for a long time, and some that still do not. There are communities that have not allowed people of color to have full access to leadership, let alone membership, and that extends to people from the LGBTQ and I communities as well. So this, is Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart here speaking at a vigil in 2019. And I think this is a time period. So here I am recording here in June of 2020, where we are seeing so much activity nationwide and even globally, especially around issues of racial inequality. And this extends to hard looks and critique of not just racial, but gender-based and sexuality-based inequalities in lots of different systems. And so religious groups are a part of that for sure, on all possible sides of that, both pushing for equality and sometimes not so much. So, this is another way for you who are listening, if you're interested, start by studying the religious groups that are near you. And this should be pretty clear, I think, on their website, or you can even speak to someone on the phone and ask them, oh, well, where do they stand on these issues? And you can get a pretty good idea, I would think, pretty quickly. So I think it's just become an increasingly important part of our religious studies toolkit is to acknowledge the fact that for so long the way we studied traditions was by assuming a dominant white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered perspective that was the norm. And I think we just gained so much by broadening our perspectives to acknowledge a whole host of additional voices. Here are some additional resources that I recommend. I'll just walk you through them very briefly. So Stephen Prothero's God is Not One is a very accessible text talking about the 8, he calls them rival religions. God is not one, the 8 rival religions that run the world. Tomoko Matsuzawa, her book, The Invention of World Religions, is a classic. It's more of the type of text you would have in a college classroom, but I still think it's written in a way that's quite accessible, and especially if you're interested in learning more about how this concept of religion, it comes out of the European sort of Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, and then gets applied to other traditions around the world, then her book just has lots of really great details. I'm a big admirer of her work. Next, if we look at the pewforum.org, this has a lot of data-driven information, a lot of surveys on what people think about religion and spirituality here in the US and all around the world. Religion Dispatches is more of a news site, and so you'll have a lot of articles about very current events. They try and respond very, very quickly to whatever's happening in the world. And then my favorite actually is this one, keepingit101.com. This is, I will just disclose, a website and a podcast specifically run by two professors that I know. We all went to the same PhD program. They, are far senior to me. But this is designed for, I think, mostly for like general audience, and then it's designed so it can be used easily in a college classroom. But I really think anyone would benefit from it. So those are some good resources. And of course, there's lots more. And in the slides or the presentations that are going to come after this one, we're going to be sharing additional resources specific to the particular traditions that we're looking at. And here we are back at the beginning. Of course, we're here at the end. Thank you for joining me on this very quick, very surface level discussion of, not only religious traditions, but specifically, how do we talk about religion? What is religion? What are some different ways of defining it? Where do those definitions come from? I look forward to having you join us for the following sessions. Thank you so much.